My son flatly kicked me out of his house on Christmas morning. Look at your frayed coat, Dad. We're throwing a massive party today, and both my in-laws and the CEO are here. You showing up right now only embarrasses me. Without a word, I silently turned away into the freezing snow, looking for another place to be useful. But that very night, my phone rang non-stop. His voice was trembling, breaking with pure panic on the line, Dad. Why are you on the news right now? What is the meaning of what you said? I am incredibly grateful to have you here. To help us connect, please comment below with the country or city you are watching from. Also keep in mind, this narrative incorporates fictional elements for entertainment and instructional design. Any overlap with actual names or locations is accidental, but the core message delivered to you remains highly valuable. The morning smelled like pine needles and cold. I had wrapped the gift the night before, sitting at my kitchen table, with a roll of tape that kept losing its edge and a pair of scissors that were older than Thomas himself. The box wasn't anything fancy. Inside was a wool scarf I had picked out at Henderson's on 5th, the kind of store where nothing costs more than $40, and the woman at the register always calls you hun. I figured Thomas could use it. Ohio winters don't care how much money you make. I loaded the box into the passenger seat of my truck at 9:30. The roads were quiet, the way roads only get on Christmas morning back in 2024. No school buses, no delivery trucks. Just a few cars moving slow and careful through a city that had decided for one day at least to take a breath. Snow from the night before sat clean and undisturbed on the lawns. The kind of snow that makes everything look better than it actually is. Thomas lived in Maplewood Estates, one of those newer subdivisions on the north side of Dayton, where every house has a 3-car garage and a landscaped front yard that looks like it was designed by someone who had never actually played in one. The houses were big, the kind of big that announces itself before you even pull into the driveway. I had been there maybe a dozen times over the years. Always felt like I was visiting a hotel where I hadn't quite made a reservation. I turned onto Sycamore Ridge Drive and spotted the house at the end of the cul-de-sac. Thomas's place. Black shutters, stone facade, a wreath on the door that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. There were 2 cars parked out front that I didn't recognize. A silver Mercedes and a black Cadillac Escalade, both gleaming like they had been detailed that morning. I recognized Thomas's Audi in the driveway. I pulled my truck to the curb and sat there for a moment. Through the front window, I could see the glow of a chandelier and the movement of people inside. The Christmas tree they had was enormous. White lights perfectly symmetrical, the kind you order pre-decorated from a catalog. Nothing like the lopsided 7-footer Thomas and I had driven out to Carter's Tree Farm to cut down ourselves when he was 9 years old. I picked up the gift from the passenger seat, tucked it under my arm, and walked up the front path. I had barely raised my hand to knock when the door swung open. Thomas stood in the frame. He was dressed in a charcoal blazer over a pressed white shirt, hair combed back, jaw set tight, in the way it always got when he was performing for an audience. For a half second, his eyes went from my face to my coat, my old Carhartt, the brown one with the frayed left cuff that I kept meaning to replace. And something shifted behind his expression. Not anger exactly. Something colder than that. Dad? The word came out flat. Not a greeting. A notice. Merry Christmas, son. I held out the gift. I won't stay long. Just wanted to drop this off and maybe say hello to Dad. His jaw tightened another notch. I said it's not a good time. From somewhere inside the house came the sound of crystal glasses and Richard Vance's booming laugh rolling through a conversation I couldn't hear. The smell of something rich drifted out. Lobster bisque, maybe, or one of those dishes that comes with a name I couldn't pronounce. My stomach turned, though not from hunger. Thomas reached out and took the box from under my arm. Not gently. The way you take something off a conveyor belt. I'll make sure to open it later, he said. The tone of his voice made it clear he would not. I stood there on that front step with the cold working its way through my coat and looked at my son, really looked at him, and tried to find the boy who used to run to the door when he heard my truck pulling in. The boy who fell asleep on my shoulder during long drives and called me Pop until he was 12 years old. I looked hard. What I found instead was a man in a charcoal blazer who couldn't meet his father's eyes for more than 2 seconds at a stretch. "Thomas," I said quietly, "it's Christmas." Something moved across his face then. A flicker brief as a candle in the wind. And for just a moment, I thought he might step aside and say, come in, forget all of it." But the moment passed. His expression closed back up like a door shutting. "I'll call you next week," he said. And then he took one step back and swung the door shut in my face. The sound of it, that solid final click, landed somewhere between my ribs and didn't move. I stood there on the step for what felt like a long time. Probably wasn't more than 10 seconds. The cold had found my ears now, and my bad knee was starting to ache the way it always did when the temperature dropped below 30. I exhaled slowly, watching my breath disappear into the winter air, and then I turned around and walked back toward my truck. I was almost to the curb when something made me glance back, through the long narrow window beside the front door. One of those decorative side lights, frosted at the edges, but clear in the middle. I could see Thomas in the foyer. He was holding the gift I had wrapped the night before, the one I had spent 20 minutes getting the corners right on. He looked at it for a moment with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Then he turned and dropped it, casually, almost carelessly, into the tall wicker wastebasket sitting just inside the entry. My chest tightened so hard I had to remind myself to breathe. He didn't slam it in, didn't make a scene. Just let it fall the way you discard a piece of junk mail you didn't bother to open. Then he straightened his blazer and walked back toward the sound of Richard Vance's laughter. I turned back to my truck, got in, closed the door with both hands because one of them had started shaking. The heater took a minute to kick in. I sat there with my hands on the wheel, staring at the house with its perfect wreath and its chandelier light, and its 2 strangers' cars parked out front like sentinels, and I waited for something to happen inside my chest. Anger, maybe, or grief, or that specific kind of hurt that has a name but you can never quite say it out loud. What I felt instead was something quieter and harder to name, like the moment you realize a wound is deeper than you first thought, and the numbness is the only thing standing between you and the full weight of it. I put the truck in drive. I didn't go home. Nobody warns you about the silence that comes after a door closes. Not the silence of an empty house or the silence of a long drive with the radio off. This was different, the kind that settles into the space behind your ribs and simply stays patient and without apology, like it has nowhere else to be, and no intention of leaving before it's ready. I drove without a plan. I turned left out of Sycamore Ridge Drive because left felt marginally less wrong than right, and after that I just followed wherever the roads went. Dayton on Christmas morning looked like a city that had politely agreed to absent itself for the day. Traffic signals cycled through their sequences for empty intersections. A few storefronts along 5th still had paper snowflakes in their windows, curling at the edges where the tape had given up. A single delivery truck sat idling at a red light with no particular urgency. My hands were cold despite the heater. I gripped the wheel tighter than I needed to. Almost without deciding to, I found myself on Elm Street. My old neighborhood, mine and Sandra's, back when those 2 words meant something. We had divorced when Thomas was 6, divided things, the way people divide things when there isn't much to divide. The house was still standing on the corner of Elm and Birchwood, painted a different color now, a slate gray that didn't suit the trim, but the red maple in the front yard was unchanged, standing bare in the snow, patient, as the kind of thing that outlasts almost everything around it. I slowed down without stopping, kept moving. Thomas had grown up shuttling between that house and my apartment on Caldwell Avenue, 2 miles of distance that a small boy learned to navigate before he was old enough to resent it. He was good at it. Better than most children would have been. He figured out early how to pack a bag on Friday afternoon and unpack it quietly on Sunday evening without making a scene of either. He never complained about the arrangement, never weaponized it the way some kids do. I had taken that steadiness as a sign of strength. I drove past Carver Elementary, where Thomas had attended from kindergarten through 5th grade. The playground was buried deep in snow, the swings hanging still, the metal slide capped white. I had stood at that chain-link fence once a Tuesday afternoon in October, not his pickup day, just a day I happened to pass, and watched him in a 4-square game with boys whose names I never learned. He hadn't seen me yet. His face was open and unself-conscious, laughing at something that happened in the game, inhabiting his own happiness completely. The way children do before they learn that happiness is something to be managed. I had stood at that fence for 10 minutes just watching him. I kept driving. There was one Christmas in particular that would not leave me alone on that drive, no matter how much road I put between myself and Sycamore Ridge Drive. Thomas was 7 years old. First Christmas after the divorce Sandra had the week before I had Christmas Day itself. I had stayed up until 2 in the morning, assembling a red bicycle in my apartment living room, working from instructions that had clearly been written by someone who had never attempted to follow instructions. I stripped a bolt. I put the front reflector on backwards 3 times. I sat on my floor at 1:30 with parts spread across the carpet and a cup of cold coffee at my elbow, and spoke out loud to the empty room, "You are going to figure this out." I figured it out. Thomas came down at 6:45 in his dinosaur pajamas, eyes still half closed, hair sideways. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and stared at the bicycle with the bow on the handlebars. His mouth fell open. Then he looked at me, and his whole face crumpled, not with sadness, but with something too large for a 7-year-old body to hold quietly. He ran across the room and threw his arms around my neck, hard enough to nearly knock me off the couch cushion. He said my name over and over into my shoulder. Pop, pop, pop. I held him. He was the only solid thing in the room that morning. He was the only solid thing in a great deal of my world during those particular years, though I didn't say it then, and haven't said it since because some truths are too heavy to hand to a child. By the time I pulled into the parking lot at Eden Park, the heater had warmed the cab, and my hands had stopped shaking. The park was empty, benches, buried paths, erased bare trees standing in the pale light, like witnesses to something. I cut the engine, picked up my travel mug from the cup holder. Cold coffee. I drank it anyway because some habits persist past any reasonable justification for them. I thought about the evening Thomas was 16 and called me at 11 o'clock on a school night, voice brittle with panic over a math problem he couldn't solve before the SAT the next morning. I had just come off a full route 9 hours on foot, a shoulder that had been bothering me for 2 weeks. I sat at my kitchen table with a notepad and worked through it with him for 2 hours. I got things wrong twice and had to correct myself, and the second time it happened, Thomas laughed, really laughed, surprised out of himself, and something eased between us that had been tight. He called me from the parking lot the day he got his scores. I was in the middle of a route. I pulled over and sat on the curb and grinned until my face hurt, and my supervisor's voice crackled on the radio, asking my location, and I told him I'd be a few minutes, and I didn't care at all. I sat in that parking lot and breathed the cold air. 32 years, I said out loud. Not with bitterness. More the way you say something when you need to hear it outside of your own head. When the inside of your own head has been running it too long and you need to know if it sounds different spoken aloud. It didn't sound different. 2 blocks away, past the bare elms and a closed coffee shop, a sign glowed amber in the gray afternoon light. Dayton Community Warming Center. The lights inside were on. Through the glass, I could see the movement of people, warm shapes in a warm space, active and purposeful. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I started the truck. The warmth hit me before I even got the door fully open. It came out in a wave. Coffee and wool blankets, and the particular smell of a space that has held too many people for too many years to ever quite air out completely. I stood in the doorway for a half second, letting it wash over me, and felt something in my chest loosen just slightly. Not much, but enough to notice. The Dayton Community Warming Center occupied what had once been the ground floor of St. Augustine's Parish Hall, a squat brick building on Clement Street that the diocese had sold off 15 years ago when the congregation outgrew it and moved to a newer building on the east side. Somebody had done their best with the interior. Folding tables arranged in long rows, metal chairs with the kind of seat cushions that compress flat if you look at them wrong, a pair of industrial coffee urns on a card table near the entrance, both running. Along the far wall, blankets were stacked in neat piles from floor to chest height. Wool fleece, the occasional sleeping bag donated by someone who had cleaned out a closet. There were maybe 25 people inside. A cluster of men near the radiator passing a newspaper back and forth without reading it. An elderly woman in a house dress, sitting very straight in her chair, with her hands folded in her lap, watching everything with calm, dark eyes. A younger woman in the far corner with a sleeping infant strapped to her chest, rocking slightly, staring at the middle distance. Nobody was celebrating Christmas in any traditional sense, but nobody looked like they needed to. I had been coming here on and off for nearly a decade. Started the winter after Sandra and I split. I had 2 days off between routes and didn't know what to do with the quiet, so I showed up and asked if they needed an extra pair of hands. They did. I kept coming back. Some habits stick, not because you decide to keep them, but because stopping would require a decision you never quite get around to making. Arthur Pendleton. The voice came from somewhere behind a stack of blanket boxes. A moment later, Margaret Ellis appeared around the corner of the supply table, and the sight of her, red wool sweater, salt and pepper hair pinned up in a bun that was already losing the battle against the afternoon, was one of the most genuinely welcome things I had seen all day. Margaret had run the warming center for 11 years. She was the kind of woman who remembered the names of every regular who came through the door, kept 3 different to-do lists simultaneously, and would tell you exactly what she thought of your decisions without raising her voice or sugarcoating a single syllable. We had worked enough shifts together that she could read my face the way a mechanic reads an engine. A quick look, and she already knew something was running wrong. She crossed the room and gripped my hand in both of hers, firm and warm. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Not unkindly, genuinely curious. "It's Christmas, Arthur. Don't you have—" She stopped, looked at me more carefully, her head tilted just slightly to one side. "Plans changed," I said. She held my gaze for another moment. Then she nodded, once the way people nod when they've decided to respect something they don't fully understand yet. "Well," she said, releasing my hand and turning back toward the supply table, "we're short 2 volunteers and the coffee urn on the left is acting up again. So your timing is either terrible or perfect." "Story of my life," I said. She handed me a stack of blankets without ceremony and pointed me toward the back of the room. I fell into the rhythm of it quickly. The way you fall into any work you've done long enough that your hands know what to do before your brain catches up. Move through the room. Check in with people. Refill the coffee cups. Drag a chair closer to the radiator for a man whose knees were bothering him. The small mechanics of making a space a little more bearable for the people inside it. Near the radiator, I met Walter Gaines. 78 years old, Korean War-era veteran, originally from Covington, Kentucky. He had a paper cup of coffee balanced on his knee, and an opinion about everything from the city's snow removal schedule to the designated hitter rule in baseball. I sat with him for 10 minutes and listened. and offered enough responses to keep him going. And by the end of it, he was laughing at his own story about a busted Jeep in the winter of 1952. And I was smiling in spite of everything. That was the thing about this place. It had a way of pulling you out of your own head, whether you wanted it to or not. Around 5 o'clock, Margaret appeared at my elbow and tilted her head toward the corner of the room. "Got a minute?" We moved away from the main tables toward the supply area near the back wall. Margaret was carrying a piece of paper, a letter from the look of it. Official letterhead. She held it for a moment before she spoke, and I noticed her jaw was set tighter than usual. "I didn't want to bring this up on Christmas," she said. "But since you're here and since it affects the whole operation," she handed me the letter. I took it. Read the heading first. Dayton Regional Medical Center. Office of Community Engagement and Strategic Partnerships. Dated November 14th. The letter was 2 paragraphs. Professional language, polished sentences, the kind of writing that says something uncomfortable while making it sound almost reasonable. The substance of it was this: Dayton Regional Medical Center was discontinuing its annual community outreach grant to the Dayton Community Warming Center, effective January 1st. The reason given was a reallocation of the community outreach budget toward, and I am quoting directly here, strategic partnership events aligned with the institution's long-term development goals. In plain language, the hospital was pulling $25,000 a year from a winter shelter to spend it on gala dinners. That grant covered our heating bill and half our blanket supply for the whole season, Margaret said quietly. We've been scrambling since November trying to figure out what we're going to do come February. I was still looking at the letter. At the bottom above the printed name of the signatory was a signature I recognized. Not because I had seen Thomas's professional signature before, because I had watched him practice his handwriting at my kitchen table when he was 12 years old, pressing down too hard with the pen the way he always did. Thomas Pendleton, MD, Deputy Director, Community and Strategic Budget Allocation. My stomach dropped about 3 floors. I set the letter down on the supply table very carefully, looked up at the room, at Walter with his paper cup, at the young mother in the corner, at the stack of blankets that now represented a problem I hadn't known about 20 minutes ago. The old radiator against the wall clanked and hissed, working as hard as it could. Margaret was watching me. "Arthur," her voice was careful, "is there something I should know about?" "No," I said, firmly but not harshly. I picked up the next stack of blankets from the table and squared them under my arm. "There's nothing you need to know. Let's keep moving." She opened her mouth, then closed it, nodded. We kept moving. By 6 o'clock, the storm outside had changed character. What had started as a steady snowfall was now something more serious. Wind driving the flakes sideways against the windows, the glass vibrating faintly in its frames. 2 of our volunteers pulled Margaret aside to let her know they needed to head home before the roads got worse. She thanked them and let them go without making them feel guilty about it. That was Margaret. After they left, she stood at the window for a moment, arms crossed, watching the weather. Then she turned around. "I've still got a drop scheduled for Riverside," she said. 15 blankets. I called ahead this morning. There's a family over there. 3 kids their landlord hasn't fixed the heat since November. She paused. I promised them. I was already reaching for my coat. "Arthur, the roads. What's the address?" I asked. She looked at me with an expression that had equal parts gratitude and worry in it. "It's getting bad out there. I don't want you to." "Margaret." I pulled my coat on and started doing up the buttons. I delivered mail through every winter this city has thrown at me for 30 years. I know what a bad road looks like. I held out my hand. "Address." She exhaled slowly through her nose. Then she tore a corner off the notepad on the table, wrote down the address, and placed it in my palm. "Be careful," she said. Her voice had gone quieter. The way people's voices go when they mean something more than the words they're using. "Always am," I said. I tucked the address into my breast pocket, picked up the box of 15 blankets, and pushed through the door into the dark and the cold and the thickening snow. The Riverside drop took less than 10 minutes. The address Margaret had given me was a 2-story rental on the corner of Riverside Boulevard and Crane Street. The kind of building that had probably been decent housing 20 years ago and had been coasting on that reputation ever since. The mailboxes in the entryway had 3 names on them. I buzzed the middle unit. A woman came to the door. Late 20s, maybe 30, wearing a sweatshirt with a university logo so faded I couldn't make out which one. She had the particular kind of tired in her eyes that isn't fixed by sleep, the kind that comes from worrying about the same thing for too many days in a row. Behind her I could hear children, at least 2 of them, maybe 3, the high-frequency sound of small people who had been cooped up indoors too long. "Mr. Pendleton," she said. Margaret had called ahead. "Yes, ma'am." I held up the box. 15 blankets from the warming center. Merry Christmas. Something shifted in her face. Her chin trembled for just a moment before she got it back under control. She reached out and took the box with both arms, pressing it against her chest, like it was something more than blankets. "Thank you," she said. The words came out thicker than she intended. "Seriously, thank you." "You're welcome," I said. "You keep those kids warm tonight." She nodded. Her eyes were bright. I turned around before either of us had to figure out what to say next. Back in the truck, I checked the dashboard clock. 8:47. The storm had worsened while I was inside. The wind had picked up another notch, and the snow was coming down in the kind of dense, heavy curtain that swallows headlights and turns familiar roads into guesswork. I sat for a moment, both hands on the wheel, watching the wipers work. The radio came on when I started the engine. An automated National Weather Service alert was cycling through the speakers. Winter storm warning for Montgomery County, sustained winds 22 miles per hour, ice accumulation on secondary roads and elevated surfaces, motorists advised to avoid unnecessary travel. I turned the radio off. I had driven mail routes through worse than this. Not that it made me cavalier about it. If anything, experience makes you more careful, not less, because experience teaches you exactly what can go wrong. I pulled out of the parking spot slowly, tires finding their grip on the packed snow, and headed toward Route 35 East. The streets through the Riverside neighborhood were empty in the way that feels slightly unreal. Traffic lights cycling through their sequences, for nobody's storefronts, dark, behind their Christmas window, displays a single set of tire tracks in the snow ahead of me that had already begun to fill in. Dayton had gone to bed. The whole city had pulled a blanket over itself and decided the weather could wait until morning. I drove at about 20 miles per hour. No rush. Nobody waiting. Somewhere around 5th and Clement, a thought surfaced that I had been keeping below the waterline all evening. Thomas's signature on that letter. The clean, deliberate loop of the T, the way the letters pressed hard into the page. The same handwriting I had watched develop from awkward block letters on a 3rd-grade homework assignment to the confident pen strokes of a man who had decided his signature was something worth cultivating. $25,000. The heating bill. The blankets for winter. Walter Gaines keeping warm by the radiator. The woman in the corner with her infant. Gone with one signature redirected toward a gala dinner for people who were not cold. I pressed my back teeth together and focused on the road. "Stop," I said out loud to myself to the empty cab of the truck. "Just drive, Arthur." I drove. Route 35 East was quieter than the neighborhood streets. Longer sightlines, which would have been reassuring if the headlights weren't dissolving into snow about 40 yards out. I stayed in the right lane and kept my speed steady. The heater was doing its job, but my left knee was aching in the way it did when the temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there, a deep, grinding protest that I had learned to interpret as the joint's running commentary on my life choices. I was about 3 miles from my exit when something caught my eye. It was on the right shoulder, maybe 100 yards ahead, a shape that didn't belong there. My brain registered it before I could fully articulate what I was seeing, a geometry that was wrong angles, that didn't match the landscape, a flash of reflected light in a place where there shouldn't have been any. I eased off the gas. The truck slowed. Then I saw the hazard lights. One of them anyway. The left one blinking in the dark, the right one apparently gone. Blinking orange in the snow, patient and distressed at the same time. I moved my foot to the brake and applied pressure carefully, steadily, the way you brake on ice when you know that panic is the enemy. The truck slowed without sliding. I pulled as far right as I could and brought it to a stop on the shoulder, keeping my own hazards going, leaving as much road between me and whatever was ahead as I could manage. Then I got out and walked forward. The cold grabbed me immediately. Not just the temperature, but the wind behind it driving snow into my face and finding every gap in my coat collar and cuffs. I put my head down and kept moving. It was a sedan. A dark blue one from what I could tell. A mid-sized family car, the kind of vehicle that gets chosen for its reliability rather than anything else. It had left the road at an angle and gone down the embankment on the right shoulder. Not a steep drop, maybe 6 or 8 feet, but enough to tip the car onto its passenger side. It lay there at roughly a 45-degree angle, the undercarriage facing partially toward the road, one rear wheel still spinning slowly in the cold air, as though it hadn't quite accepted what had happened. The windshield on the driver's side was cracked in a spiderweb pattern. The front passenger window was gone entirely. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911 before I took another step. 911, what is your emergency? Vehicle accident on Route 35 East, I said. Eastbound roughly 3 miles past the Clement Street interchange. Single vehicle gone off the right shoulder, lying on its side. I can see at least one person inside. I'm going to approach now. Sir, please stay at a safe distance until... I understand, I said. I'm approaching carefully. I ended the call. They had the location, they had the nature of the emergency, that was enough. I moved down the embankment, planting each foot, deliberately testing the slope before I committed my weight. That was when I heard it. Through the wind and the snow and the settling metal sounds of a car that had just been through something violent, a sound that cut through all of it, high-pitched, thin, unmistakable. A child crying, very small, very frightened, very much alive. I felt something shift in my body. Not panic, something more focused than that. The particular kind of clarity that arrives when a situation becomes simple, when all the other noise falls away, and there is only the thing directly in front of you that needs to be done. At the same moment, from beneath the hood of the sedan, a thin column of white smoke began to rise, curling upward from the seam between the hood and the front quarter panel, mixing with the snowfall, growing steadily thicker as I watched. I went down the rest of that embankment at a pace that my knee was going to have opinions about later. The crying got louder as I got closer. By the time my boots hit the bottom of the embankment, I could hear it clearly through the wind. A child's voice, high and exhausted in the way that means they've been frightened for longer than their small body knows how to handle. I moved toward the passenger side of the car, which was now facing upward, and found the driver's window, or what was left of it. The impact had spiderwebbed the glass and pushed most of it inward. A few jagged pieces still clung to the frame. I pulled my sleeve down over my fist and cleared the remaining glass away from the lower edge of the frame. Something bit into the heel of my hand anyway. I noted it the way you note a minor inconvenience when there are more pressing matters, which is to say, I didn't stop moving. I got my hands on the door frame and looked inside. The woman in the front seat was conscious. 30s dark hair, blood from a small cut at her hairline that looked worse than it probably was. The airbag had deployed and was now deflating into her lap. Her seatbelt had locked across her chest, pinning her firmly against the seat, which was now tilted sideways at an angle that made everything awkward and nothing easy. Her hands were pressed flat against the dashboard as she tried to brace herself against the tilted frame. She looked at me and her whole face broke open. "My daughter," she said, and her voice came out in pieces. "She's in the back. Please, please, she's in the back." "I see her," I said. "I'm going to get her. What's her name?" "Lily." The word tore out of her. "Her name is Lily. She's Lily," I repeated, kept my voice even. "I'm going to get Lily right now. You stay as still as you can. Help is on the way." I shifted my grip on the doorframe and looked into the back seat. She was wedged into the lower corner of the back seat, the corner that had become the floor when the car tipped. A little girl in a pair of pajamas printed with small red reindeer, her knees pulled up to her chest. Both hands pressed over her ears, the way children do when the world has gotten too loud. Her eyes were open and fixed on me the moment I appeared in the window frame above her. She had stopped making sound. That was the thing that hit me hardest. She had been crying so long that she had gone past sound into something beyond it. A silent, shaking distress that was somehow worse than the noise had been. "Hey," I said, quietly, like I had all the time in the world. "Hey there. My name's Arthur. I'm going to get you out. Okay, everything's going to be just fine." She stared at me. 4 years old, maybe 40 pounds, soaking wet eyes the size of quarters. "Can you reach up toward me?" I asked. "Can you try that for me?" One small hand came up, slowly uncertain. I reached down as far as I could, got my hand around her forearm and started lifting. My left knee screamed at the angle I had to hold. The joint had opinions that I was not in a position to negotiate with right now. I braced my right foot against the exterior of the car and pulled steadily, carefully bringing her up through the window frame inch by inch, making sure nothing snagged, making sure she was clear. She came out into the cold air and I pulled her against my chest and stepped back from the car. She weighed almost nothing. That was what registered first. How light she was, how small a space she took up against my ribcage. Children are always smaller than you expect until you're holding one. Then they're exactly the right size. I carried her 5 steps away from the car and crouched down in the snow, setting her on her feet, but keeping both hands on her shoulders. "You're safe," I told her. "You're out. You're safe." She looked at my face for a long moment. Her chin was still trembling. Her breath was coming in those ragged little hitches that follow extended crying. Then she reached both arms up. I picked her up again. She wrapped her arms around my neck and pressed her face into my shoulder and began to cry again. Properly this time, the full-throated, unrestrained kind, the kind that means the fear has broken and something safer has replaced it. Her whole small body shook with it. I stood in the snow and held that little girl and felt something move through my chest that I hadn't felt all day. Something warm. Something that had nothing to do with the temperature. My coat went around her shoulders a moment later. It swallowed her completely. She disappeared into it like something being tucked away for safekeeping. I set her down gently on a flat patch of snow, made sure she was stable, and turned back to the car. "Lily's out," I called toward the front window. "She's okay. I'm coming for you now." "Thank God," she said. Her voice was still shaking, but the register had changed entirely. "Thank God, thank God." Getting Claire out was a different kind of problem. The seatbelt had locked across her torso, and the release mechanism was jammed, probably from the force of the impact. I talked her through trying it herself twice before I understood that it wasn't going to cooperate without tools I didn't have. I told her to keep still and to keep talking to me, and she did, her voice climbing and dropping as the adrenaline worked through her system. The fire trucks arrived 4 minutes after I had reached the car. That is not a long time in most contexts. It is a very specific kind of long time when you are crouched in the snow next to an overturned vehicle with a woman trapped inside and white smoke thickening from the engine compartment. 2 engines and a medic unit lights cutting through the snowfall. The sound of doors and equipment and organized voices taking over the scene with the efficiency of people who have done this many times before. A firefighter in full gear came down the embankment and assessed the situation in about 8 seconds. "Sir, we've got it from here," he said. I stepped back. Let them work. Watched them cut the seatbelt with a tool that made the job look easy. Claire out through the window with practiced hands get her onto a backboard and up the embankment. Watched a paramedic examine Lily, my coat still wrapped around her tiny shoulders, and declare her uninjured apart from fright. I was standing at the edge of the scene, weight on my right leg, left knee, making its complaints known in no uncertain terms when I noticed the blood on my right hand. The heel of it, where the glass had found me. Not deep. Enough to sting now that the adrenaline was starting to recede. A firefighter handed me a piece of gauze without being asked. I pressed it against my palm. "You the one that got the kid out?" he said. "Yes." He looked at me for a moment. "Good work." I nodded. Didn't have much to add to that. That was when someone touched my shoulder. I turned around. She was younger than I expected. Early 30s. Dark coat with a station logo on the breast hair that the wind had been making editorial decisions about for the past several minutes. Behind her, a man with a camera was settling it onto his shoulder with the practiced ease of someone who did this in all weather. "Sir, I'm Rachel Bennett from WHIO-TV, she said. Her voice was steady and professional, but there was something genuine underneath it. The kind of alertness that comes not from chasing a story, but from actually being affected by one. I was nearby covering a weather feature and heard the dispatch. "I don't want to intrude, but can I ask you a few questions about what happened here tonight?" I looked at her. At the camera. At Lily, 20 feet away, sitting on the back of the ambulance with my old Carhartt wrapped around her like a blanket, watching the firefighters with wide, exhausted eyes. "Yeah," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. "All right. Camera lights are brighter than you expect." I had been on the receiving end of one exactly once before in my life. A local news crew had come out to cover a story about postal workers during a particularly bad ice storm back in 2003, and one of the reporters had pointed a camera at me for about 45 seconds before deciding I wasn't interesting enough to keep on tape. I had not been offended. This felt different. The light Rachel Bennett's cameraman aimed at me cut through the darkness and the snowfall with the kind of authority that makes everything around it disappear. The burning car, the fire trucks, the medics working around Lily, all of it receded into background. There was just the light and Rachel's face and the small black microphone she held between us. She started with the easy questions. Name. How I happened to be on that stretch of road tonight. What I had seen when I pulled over. I answered each one the way I would answer a question at the post office counter. Directly, without unnecessary decoration. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I was on my way home from a volunteer drop for the warming center on Clement Street. I saw the car off the road and stopped. "And you went down to the vehicle yourself," Rachel said. It wasn't quite a question. "Someone needed to," I said. She nodded slowly, and I could see her making some kind of internal calculation. The kind journalists make when they're deciding how far to push and in which direction. "The little girl," she said. "The one you brought out. She's okay." I glanced over my shoulder. Lily was still on the back of the ambulance, sitting upright now, my Carhartt draped over her like a tent. A paramedic was crouched in front of her doing the kind of gentle assessment that involves a small flashlight and a lot of patient coaxing. Lily's head was up. Her eyes were tracking. "She's okay," I said, and I felt the truth of it settle somewhere in my chest. "Yeah, she's okay." Rachel paused for a moment. Then she shifted her weight slightly, and her tone adjusted in a way that was subtle enough that I almost didn't notice it. "Do you have family waiting for you tonight?" she asked. "Any Christmas plans?" It was the kind of question a local reporter asks at the end of a feel-good segment. The soft landing, the warm button. She was expecting something about grandchildren, probably, or a wife with a plate of food in the oven. something that would play well against footage of snow and emergency lights. I looked at the microphone, then at the ground, then back at her. The truth was sitting right there. It had been sitting there all day, actually. In the space Thomas had made when he stepped forward and filled that doorway, in the weight of the gift I had wrapped the night before, in the sound of that door clicking shut. I was 62 years old, and I had been carrying it since 9:30 that morning, and I was at that particular moment simply too tired to put it down again. "Not tonight," I said. Rachel waited. "My son's a surgeon over at Dayton Regional." I kept my voice level. "Matter of fact, the way you talk about the weather or a traffic detour. He had his wife's family in for Christmas. Nice setup. Didn't quite have room for me." I paused, looked over at Lily again. So I figured I'd find somewhere else to be useful. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds. Rachel Bennett was a professional. I could see that in the way she held herself. The microphone's steady expression, neutral, nothing in her body language that would contaminate whatever she was recording. But behind her eyes, something had moved. Not pity. Something closer to recognition. "Thank you, Mr. Pendleton," she said quietly. "I think that's everything I need." I nodded, turned back toward the ambulance. An EMT named Greg, young, efficient, the kind of calm that comes from having handled enough emergencies to know which ones are actually emergencies, found me a few minutes later and steered me toward his unit to look at my hand. He cleaned the cut on my palm, applied a proper bandage, and spent 4 minutes checking my knee range of motion with the thoroughness of someone who has been ignored by stubborn older men before and has developed strategies for dealing with it. "I'd recommend you come in and get that knee imaged," he said. "I'd recommend a lot of things I don't end up doing," I said. He gave me a look that was half professional disapproval and half reluctant amusement, and handed me a printed sheet listing symptoms that should prompt me to seek further care. I folded it and put it in my breast pocket next to the address from Margaret. The drive home took longer than usual. The storm had mostly passed. What was left was a light, desultory snowfall, the kind that comes after the main event has exhausted itself. The roads had been treated, but were still slick in patches. I drove at 30 the whole way. My street was dark and still when I turned onto it. The house looked the same as it always looked. Same porch light, same mailbox with the dent in the side from where I had backed into it 4 years ago and never quite gotten around to fixing. I had left the small lamp in the front window on. It glowed amber through the glass. Inside, I hung up my jacket, then remembered my jacket was currently keeping a 4-year-old warm somewhere on Route 35. I stood in the entryway for a moment, holding nothing, feeling the absence of it. That almost made me smile. I lowered myself into the armchair in the living room and sat very still for a minute, letting the various parts of my body report in. Knee still unhappy would continue to be unhappy for the foreseeable future. Hand manageable. Back lodging a formal complaint about the angle of the embankment. Chest quiet, in the way that comes after a long day rather than an empty one. The television was on low. I had left it running that morning the way I sometimes did when I knew I'd be coming home to a quiet house. The 11 o'clock news was wrapping up. A weatherman was summarizing what had just happened outside my window, gesturing at a map of Montgomery County with the enthusiasm of someone who finds weather genuinely interesting. I closed my eyes. I was most of the way to sleep when my phone buzzed on the side table. I opened one eye. The screen was lit up, casting a pale rectangle of light on the ceiling. "Thomas." I looked at his name on the screen for a long moment. The phone buzzed again. And again. Patient. Insistent. Something moved through me. Not anger, not dread, not the complicated grief of the afternoon. Just a flatness. The particular quiet of a man who has already spent everything he had that day and has nothing left to perform. I reached out and picked up the phone. "Hello," I said. His voice came through the line before I even finished saying hello. "What were you thinking?" Not, "Are you all right, Dad?" Not, I heard what happened. Are you hurt? Just, what were you thinking? 4 words clipped and tight, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this opening on the drive from wherever he was to wherever he was standing right now. I settled back in the armchair. The TV was off. The room was dark except for the amber reach of the streetlight coming through the front curtains. My knee was propped on the footrest. My bandaged hand was resting in my lap. "Hello, Thomas," I said. "I've had 3 people text me in the last hour," he said. The control in his voice was doing its best, but underneath it something was moving fast and hot. 3 colleagues, Dad. People I work with. People whose opinions matter to my career. Asking me if that was my father on the 11 o'clock news talking about... He stopped. Started again. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I waited to see if a question about my well-being was going to follow. It did not. "You were on television," Thomas continued, "on Christmas, talking about our family, talking about things that are private. Thomas," my voice came out quiet and even. "Are you calling to ask if I'm okay?" A pause. 1 second, maybe 2. He didn't answer the question. What he did instead was keep going, which was its own kind of answer. "I am 3 months away from a department head appointment," he said. "Do you understand what that means, what I've spent the last 4 years building toward?" And now there's a clip circulating of my father on a local news broadcast, implying that I left him out in the cold on Christmas Day. "I was out in the cold on Christmas Day," I said. "That is not the point." "Then what is the point, Thomas?" The words came out with less edge than I felt, which I considered an accomplishment under the circumstances. He pivoted. That was the word for it. A sharp, practiced turn away from the thing he couldn't answer and toward the thing he could control. He talked about narrative. He talked about perception. He talked about the way these things spread online and how one 30-second clip could define a person in ways that had nothing to do with reality. He talked about what he had worked for and what he had sacrificed and what he needed from me right now, which was apparently my cooperation in making this go away. His voice rose as he went. The control began to slip by degrees. Each sentence a little faster, a little less careful, a little more like the boy who used to throw his baseball glove when he struck out, and then deny it afterward. Except the baseball glove had been replaced with something that actually had consequences. "I will have people on this by tomorrow morning," he said. "I will have a statement out. I will make sure everyone understands the context of what you said and why you said it. But I need you to not do any more interviews, not talk to any more reporters, not—" "Thomas," I said. He kept going. "Thomas." He stopped. The room was very quiet. I could hear the furnace running somewhere in the back of the house. Outside, a car moved slowly down the street, its headlights sweeping across the ceiling. "You didn't ask if I was hurt," I said. "Not once. In this entire conversation, you have not asked me once if I was okay." The silence on the other end of the line had a different quality than the ones before it. I didn't wait for him to fill it. I placed the phone down on the side table. Not hard, not with any drama attached to it. Just set it down the way you set down something you're finished with, and sat back in the chair. The call ended on his end a few seconds later. I watched the screen go dark. I sat there, in the quiet of my living room, with my bad knee and my bandaged hand, and the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent a full day being tested in more directions than he can count. And I thought about Lily, about the weight of her in my arms, about the way she had pressed her face into my shoulder and held on, about how in 32 years of being someone's father, I could not remember the last time my own child had held on like that. The thought didn't make me angry. It just made me very, very tired. I fell asleep in the chair with the lamp off and the streetlight painting stripes across the ceiling. And I didn't wake up until the morning found me. The morning when it came was gray and unhurried. I opened my eyes to the familiar ache of a night spent in an upright position. Neck stiff, lower back filing a formal grievance, left knee still keeping score from the night before. The phone was where I had left it on the side table. I picked it up. 19 unread messages, 4 missed calls. I set the phone face down on the table and went to make coffee first. Some things require preparation. The coffee maker ran its cycle while I stood at the kitchen window and watched the street outside. A neighbor's dog was making determined progress through the snow on the sidewalk, dragging its owner behind it. The sky was the color of old dishwater. Somewhere a snowplow was working its way through a distant street, the sound of it traveling clean and clear through the cold air. I poured a mug and sat down at the kitchen table. The messages were from numbers I recognized and numbers I didn't. Sandra, Margaret, 2 of my old post office colleagues, and then a run of numbers with date and area codes that I didn't know. 7, 8, 9 of them messages arriving in the small hours of the morning from people who had seen something on their screens and felt moved to reach out to a stranger. I scrolled past the unknown numbers and opened Sandra's message first. It read, "Saw the news. Are you all right? Call me when you can." I set the phone down and drank my coffee. Then I picked it back up and opened the link Margaret had sent at 6:43 in the morning. It led to the WHIO-TV website. The clip from the night before was at the top of the local news page. The view counter beneath it read 47,000. I stared at that number for a long moment. 47,000 people had watched me stand in the snow in my work clothes and say without particular drama or eloquence that my son hadn't had room for me at his Christmas table. The doorbell rang. I looked up from my phone toward the front of the house, set the mug down, pushed back from the table. I was not expecting anyone, but something in the set of my shoulders, some old instinct developed over decades of delivering things to people's doors, told me I already knew who it was before I got there. I already knew it wasn't a neighbor. Neighbors on my street tended to wave from driveways and leave plates of cookies on the porch. They didn't ring doorbells at 7:40 in the morning the day after Christmas. I set my coffee mug down on the kitchen table, pushed back from my chair, and made my way to the front door. Rachel Bennett was standing on my porch. She was dressed for the weather, heavy coat, scarf, gloves tucked into her pocket, and she was holding a coffee cup from the Sunoco station 2 blocks over, which told me she had been up for a while and had stopped being subtle about it. She had the particular look of a reporter who has convinced herself that showing up at someone's house before 8 in the morning is reasonable under the circumstances and is about 60% sure she's right. "Mr. Pendleton," she said, "I'm sorry for coming by without calling. Margaret Ellis at the warming center gave me your address. I wanted to... I can come back at a better time if... You'd better come in," I said. She followed me to the kitchen. I refilled my mug and poured a second one and set it across from me without asking. We sat down on opposite sides of the table the way people sit when they both understand something needs to be said, and neither one is entirely sure where to start. Rachel started. "The clip from last night," she said. "I don't know if you've been tracking it, but it's moving fast. When I filed this morning, it had cleared 120,000 views on the station's page alone. That doesn't count what's been shared independently." She paused. "It's not the rescue, Mr. Pendleton. I mean, the rescue is part of it. But what people keep sharing is the 30 seconds where you talked about your son." I looked at my coffee. "People are putting their own stories in the comments," she continued. "Parents who haven't been invited to their children's homes for the holidays. People who've been quietly cut out of family gatherings for years. I've been reading them since 4 this morning." She stopped again, and something shifted in her expression, the professional distance thinning slightly. "There are a lot of them." "I imagine there are," I said. Rachel set her own cup down and looked at me directly. "I'd like to do a longer piece. Not about the accident. About you. About your volunteer work." Margaret told me this morning you've been coming to the warming center for nearly a decade, that you've helped fund their blanket supply out of pocket some winters when the budget ran short. She hesitated. She also told me that the grant the warming center lost last month, the one from Dayton Regional, that your son was the one who signed off on cutting it. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the neighbor's dog from earlier was barking at something in the yard next door. "Rachel," I said, "I don't want this to be a story about Thomas." She nodded slowly. "I understand that. I mean it. I know you do." She held my gaze. "But I want you to understand something too. The story has already decided what it's about. I'm just asking if you'll let me tell it accurately." I looked at her for the long moment. She didn't flinch, and she didn't push. Just waited the way people wait when they mean what they said and don't need to say it again. "Let me think about it," I said. She nodded, reached into her coat pocket, and produced a business card. She placed it on the table between us, finished her coffee in 2 long sips, and stood up. "Thank you for the coffee," she said. "And for last night. What you did for that little girl." She stopped. Started again more carefully. "It mattered." "She's okay," I said. "That's what matters." Rachel nodded once more and let herself out. I stayed at the table and listened to the front door close and her footsteps down the porch steps and the sound of her car starting in the street. Then I picked up my phone. 138,000 views now. The number had moved while we were sitting there talking. I set the phone face down on the table. I was not comfortable being the center of anything. That was the plain truth of it. 30 years of carrying mail had conditioned me to move through spaces, efficiently deliver what needed delivering, and remove myself before I became part of anyone's story. The idea that 138,000 people had watched me stand in the snow and say something unremarkable about my own life sat in my chest like a stone I didn't know what to do with. I washed the 2 coffee cups, dried them, put them back in the cabinet. Then I sat back down and opened Sandra's message from earlier and typed back, "I'm fine. Hand and knee. Nothing serious. I'll call later." She responded within 30 seconds with a row of words that communicated relief and exasperation in equal measure, which was very Sandra. The morning moved. I made toast, read part of a book I had been working through since October, tried not to look at the phone. At some point, and I could not have said exactly when, something Rachel had mentioned settled differently in my thinking. She had said that Dr. David Miller, the name I recognized from the nameplate on the administrator's office on the one occasion Thomas had taken me on a tour of Dayton Regional 2 years ago, had been asking questions this morning. His secretary had apparently called the station wanting to confirm details about the incident on Route 35. I did not know what that meant. I filed it away. By noon, the snow had started again. Light, indecisive flurries that couldn't quite commit to being weather. I was standing at the kitchen window watching them when I heard it. A knock at the front door. Not the doorbell this time. A knock. 2 sharp, deliberate raps, the kind that announces itself with intention. I already knew it wasn't Rachel. Rachel rang doorbells and brought coffee and looked slightly apologetic. Whoever was on the other side of that door had knocked the way you knock when you've decided something before you arrived. I walked through the living room and opened the front door. Thomas was standing on my porch. He was in his good coat, the charcoal wool one, the one he wore to hospital events. No snow on the shoulders, which meant he had just come from the car. His hair was combed. His jaw was set in that particular way that meant he had run through this scene several times in his head on the drive over and had settled on an approach. In his right hand he held a white envelope. It was thick enough that whatever was inside it had some weight to it. He looked at me. I looked at him. "Dad," he said. His voice was calibrated, reasonable, the voice of a man in a meeting. "We need to talk." I looked at the envelope, then back at his face. "Come in," I said. There is a particular kind of silence that settles into a small house when a large problem walks through the front door. Thomas stepped into my entryway, and I closed the door behind him, and the house, which had been quietly ordinarily itself all morning, seemed to contract slightly around us. He looked around the kitchen the way people look at a place that is smaller than they remembered. The coffee maker on the counter. The dish rack with 2 cups drying in it. The calendar on the wall from the hardware store on Clement still on December, because I hadn't gotten around to turning the page. He didn't sit down. He stood near the table with the envelope in his right hand and his left hand in his coat pocket. And he had the posture of a man who had decided to be reasonable and was going to make sure I understood how reasonable he was being. "I'm not here to argue," he said. "All right," I said. "I just need you to understand what's at stake. For both of us." He placed the envelope on the table and pushed it toward me, a deliberate motion measured the kind that's been practiced. "There are 2 things in there. I'd like you to look at them." I looked at the envelope. It sat on the table between us like a thing that was used to getting what it wanted. "What's in it, Thomas?" He clasped his hands in front of him. "The first part is financial. Enough to cover your expenses for several months, no conditions attached to that portion." A pause. "The second part is a personal statement. Simple language. It just says that your comments last night were made under duress, that you were exhausted after the accident, and that they don't reflect the actual state of our family relationship." He spread his hand slightly, a gesture of reasonableness. "You sign it, I make sure it reaches the right people, and this whole thing stops being a story." I picked up the envelope, opened it. The money was in a bank envelope tucked inside. I didn't count it, but the thickness of it said more than I needed to know. The statement was a single typed page. I read it once from top to bottom. Then I read it again slowly, the way you read something, when you want to make sure you're understanding it correctly, and not just seeing what you expect to see. It was a masterpiece of careful language. Every sentence technically defensible. Phrases like, "in retrospect," and "upon reflection," and "the full context of our close family bond." The kind of document written by someone who understood that the truth could be rephrased until it resembled something else entirely. I set it back down on the table. "No," I said. Thomas inhaled through his nose. The reasonableness in his expression held, but I could see the effort it was taking. "Dad, I understand you're upset. I understand that yesterday morning was—" "You don't need to explain yesterday morning to me," I said. "I was there. What happened between us is private," he said, his voice rising slightly, despite whatever he had told himself on the drive over. "What you said on that broadcast is not private anymore. You've made something that was between our family into a public—" "Thomas." I pushed the envelope back across the table toward him. "Take it back, both of them." He didn't take it. He looked at it for a moment, and then at me. And something shifted in his face, the reasonableness giving way to something beneath it that was less polished and more honest. "You don't understand the position you've put me in," he said. "I am 3 months from a department head appointment. I have spent 4 years building the relationships and the reputation that makes that possible. 4 years, Dad. And one 30-second clip of you standing in the snow talking about our private business has people at the hospital asking questions I should not have to answer." "Then answer them honestly," I said. His jaw tightened. "That's not—" He stopped, regrouped. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped, and the quality of it had changed in a way that put me immediately on alert. "I want you to think about Lucas," he said. The name landed exactly the way he intended, like a stone dropped into still water. I felt it in my chest, a sudden tightening that had nothing to do with Thomas, and everything to do with the 5-year-old boy who called me on Sunday afternoons and asked me to tell him the one about the dog and the mailbox because he never got tired of it. "I want you to consider," Thomas continued, voice level, What it would mean for Lucas's relationship with you if this situation continued to escalate. Thomas. My voice came out very quiet, very even. He kept going. I'm not making a threat. I'm describing a reality. If you continue to make this a public matter, the environment around our family becomes... You just put your 5-year-old son on the table, I said, like a bargaining chip. The words landed. I watched them land. Something moved through Thomas's face, not guilt exactly, but the recognition of having gone somewhere he couldn't easily walk back from. His mouth opened, closed. Get out of my house, Thomas. I'm trying to... I said get out. He stood there for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually do. Then he picked up the envelope, straightened his coat, and walked to the front door. He stopped in the doorway, turned back once like a man with one more angle he hadn't tried yet. I had turned to face the kitchen window. Outside, a sparrow was working at the snow-covered bird feeder I had forgotten to fill, doing its best with what was there. I heard the door close. Lucas, 5 years old, gap-toothed grin. The way he said Grandpa Arthur with the R still soft in his mouth, not quite landed yet, still becoming itself. Thomas had held that boy up like a card he was willing to play. And the worst part, the part that sat in me like a splinter I couldn't reach, was that it had worked exactly as intended. Not to change my answer, but to cost me something in the giving of it. I picked up my phone from the counter. I scrolled to Rachel Bennett's name and looked at it for a moment. Then I pressed call. I woke at 4 in the morning, and the house was so quiet it felt like a held breath. I hadn't really slept. I'd dozed in the armchair for maybe an hour after hanging up with Rachel, and then I'd surfaced into that gray, restless half-consciousness where your body is still, but your mind won't stop moving. The lamp in the corner was still on. The television was dark. My coffee mug from the night before sat on the side table, cold and forgotten. I reached for it anyway. Old habits don't ask permission. The photograph was where I'd left it, propped against the base of the lamp, the way I sometimes set it, when the house felt too empty. It was Lucas's 4th birthday. I had taken it myself with my phone a little blurry, because my hands weren't as steady as they used to be. In the photo, Lucas was mid-laugh, eyes squinted nearly shut, both arms raised above his head, the way small children celebrate things with their whole bodies, nothing measured, nothing held back. He was wearing a paper crown that had already started to slide sideways. There was chocolate frosting on his chin. I sat in the dark and looked at that photograph for a long time. I thought about the weight of him. That specific, irreplaceable weight of a child who trusts you completely, the way Lucas used to fall asleep against my shoulder at family dinners, one small fist curled against my chest, his breath slowing and deepening until he was entirely gone. I could still feel the ghost of that weight. I probably always would. It is the kind of thing that does not leave you and you do not want it to. I thought about his laugh, high and sudden like a bird startled from a branch. I thought about the way he'd grab my index finger with both hands when we walked, not because he needed steadying, but because he wanted to, because he chose to. A 5-year-old boy choosing to hold on there is no more honest thing in the world than that. And then I thought about what Thomas had said to me a few months ago after a Sunday dinner that had ended badly. At the end of it, as he was putting on his coat to leave, he'd said it quietly, almost as an afterthought. Lucas doesn't need to know you that well, Dad. I hadn't answered him. I stood at the door and watched him go. Now sitting in the dark at 4 in the morning, with my left hand throbbing beneath its bandage and a cold cup of coffee. In my right, that sentence came back to me with a clarity that made my chest ache. Not with anger. Anger would have been cleaner, easier, something to burn through and be done with. It came back with something quieter and heavier. The particular grief of watching something you love be slowly, deliberately removed from your life. One small decision at a time, each one plausible on its own, each one accumulating into a shape you didn't recognize until you stepped back far enough to see it whole. I set the coffee down. I picked up the photograph and held it in both hands. He asks about you. Somewhere in that house on Elmwood Drive, that boy asks where you are. Claire had told me as much. He asks why Grandpa Arthur doesn't come over. He accepts the answer he's given because he's 5 years old, and 5-year-olds accept the answers they're given. But the question itself, the fact that he keeps asking it, told me something that no adult in that household was saying out loud. I had to believe that question was still being asked. I needed it to be true. By 7:15, I was in the car. I hadn't made a plan. I didn't drive out to Oakwood with any intention of confronting anyone or making a scene. I simply could not sit in that house anymore, in that particular silence, with that particular photograph and the cold of a December morning pressing against the windows. My body made the decision before my mind caught up the way it does when you've been still too long, and the stillness starts to feel indistinguishable from surrender. The snowfall from the night before had settled into a thin, even layer that caught the early light and held it soft and pale across the lawns and rooftops. I drove with both hands on the wheel, my left hand aching steadily inside the bandage, and I watched Dayton wake up around me, a delivery truck at a red light, a gas station attendant scraping pump handles, a woman walking a dog along a cleared sidewalk. Ordinary people doing ordinary things. It steadied me. It reminded me that the world was still operating on schedule regardless of what was happening inside my chest. Thomas and Claire's house was at 414 Elmwood Drive. 2-story brick colonial dark green shutters, a wreath on the door with a velvet bow still perfectly intact. The driveway was empty. I parked across the street and turned off the engine. I didn't get out. I sat with my hands on the wheel and looked at the house. The ground floor curtains were drawn. A single light burned somewhere in the back. The front yard was undisturbed snow except for one set of small boot prints near the front step. At 7:30, a light came on in the upstairs window on the left, Lucas's room. I had been in it exactly twice in the years before the distance between Thomas and me had grown too wide to cross on an ordinary evening. The room had a window seat and a bookshelf painted white and a mobile of wooden planets that turned slowly in the ceiling draft. The curtain shifted. A small shape appeared in the glass. Even from across the street, through 2 panes of glass and the thin winter light, I would have known him anywhere. Dark pajamas, a small toy turning in his fingers. He was looking out at the street the way children look out windows on early winter mornings, openly without purpose, the way you look at something when you haven't yet decided what to look for. Then he went still. After a moment, he raised his free hand, a small, hesitant wave, the kind that isn't entirely sure of itself, the kind that asks more than it declares. I pressed my palm flat against the inside of the car window. We held that for 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then the light shifted behind him, a door opening somewhere in the room, and the small shape turned away and disappeared. The curtain fell into place. The window became just a window again. I sat very still and breathed. My left hand had left a faint fog print on the glass. I watched it fade. I was reaching for the ignition when the front door of 414 Elmwood opened and Claire stepped onto the porch. Long gray coat, coffee mug in hand, hair not yet done. She saw me immediately. She walked down the steps through the gate and stopped on the sidewalk without crossing the street. I got out of the car. We met in the middle of the road, our breath making small clouds between us in the cold. "I didn't know he was coming yesterday," she said. "He didn't tell me until after. I want you to know that." "I know," I said. "It's all right." "It's not," she said quietly. We spoke for a few minutes. She confirmed what I had already begun to understand. Thomas's decisions had never been conversations. They arrived fully formed, and the household arranged itself around them. Before she turned to go, she reached into her coat pocket and produced a small piece of paper folded twice. She placed it in my hand without explanation, and walked back through the gate. I drove east without opening it. Some instinct said to wait. I pulled into the BP station on Linden Avenue and stopped the car. The paper was soft from her coat pocket. I opened it carefully, smoothing the creases against my knee. Claire's handwriting was small and precise. One line only. He kept the album. 5 words. I read them twice. Then I sat back and looked through the windshield at the gray December sky. Thomas had kept the album. I had left it on his doorstep Christmas morning. 32 years of photographs. Every version of himself I had been present for. I had watched him drop my wrapped gift into the wicker wastebasket and assumed the album was gone. I had driven away, believing it, but he kept it. I did not know what that meant. I was not ready to decide. A man can hold on to evidence of being loved while still causing considerable damage. Those two things are not mutually exclusive, but the simple, stubborn fact that the album was still in that house sat inside me like something I wasn't prepared to put down yet. I folded the paper along its original creases and tucked it into my shirt pocket close to my chest. Then I started the car. I had a phone call to finish with Rachel Bennett. And somewhere on the other side of that call, things were going to start moving. I intended to be ready when they did. But before I reveal the damning evidence that completely exposes my son's dark side, please comment "still here" so I know you are still following Arthur's journey. Also, please note, the upcoming events include some fictionalized elements structured for educational purposes. If you feel these intense realities do not suit your path, you may safely close this video right here. The folded paper was still in my shirt pocket when Rachel Bennett knocked at 2 o'clock. I had been at the kitchen table since I got home from Elmwood Drive, not doing much of anything useful. Coffee made and gone cold. Missed calls checked 11 from numbers I didn't recognize, one from Margaret that I planned to return. I took Claire's note out twice, set it flat on the table, read the 5 words, folded it back along its creases, and put it away again. He kept the album. I didn't know yet what to do with that. So I let it sit inside me the way you let something steep before you decide what it is. When the knock came, I was almost grateful for it. Rachel had a canvas bag over one shoulder and a manila folder held against her chest, with both arms, the way you carry something you don't want to bend. She had the focused look of a person who had been working since early morning and hadn't stopped, not the television version of herself, composed and ready. Just a woman with something she needed to say. "Come in out of the cold," I said. She followed me to the kitchen, set the bag down, and arranged her laptop and a legal pad on the table, with the efficiency of someone who understood that clarity of thought begins with clarity of space. I poured 2 cups of coffee without asking. We sat across from each other. "I want to be up front," she said. "Everything I'm going to show you today comes from public sources. IRS filings, hospital administrative records, online postings. Nothing obtained improperly." "All right," I said. She turned the laptop toward me. "Dayton Regional Medical Center filed Form 990 with the IRS every year, as required of all nonprofit organizations. Those filings were public record." Rachel had been reading them since before Christmas. She walked me through it carefully, not assuming ignorance, not assuming expertise, just moving through the material at the pace it deserved. The hospital set aside community benefit funding each year for programs serving the broader public. Embedded in Thomas's department allocation for 6 consecutive years was a single line item, a grant of $25,000 annually to the Dayton Community Warming Center. Last year the line was gone. In its place was a note, "Brief and administrative reallocation of community benefit resources to continuing medical education initiatives per departmental review." The money was redirected to a conference fund, Rachel said. She clicked to the next screen. "Thomas is listed as co-chair of the organizing committee. The venue is the Hyatt Regency in Columbus. Registration is $600 per attendee. The keynote dinner is $250 a plate. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about Margaret on Christmas night, holding that letter in both hands, saying we're running on fumes this winter. $25,000 wasn't a fortune. But for a place like the warming center, it was the difference between heating the building and rationing it. He knew what he was cutting, I said. He signed the reallocation request himself, Rachel said. I looked down at my coffee cup and didn't say what I was thinking, because what I was thinking was the kind of thing you carry alone for a while before you say it out loud. There's more, she said. She turned the legal pad toward me. 3 dates across the top, all within 48 hours of the clip airing on WHIO-TV. Below each date, a printed screenshot from Ohio Med Connect, a professional form requiring verified medical credentials to access. The posts were under screen names like Med Ethics Watcher and Dayton Area MD. They were about me. I read the first one carefully. It described me as having a documented pattern of financial instability, a history of erratic behavior, an estrangement from my son's family that I had brought on myself. The third used the word unstable twice in 3 sentences. I put the legal pad down. These are lies, I said. Yes, Rachel said. I believe they are. Can you prove who wrote them? She chose her words with care. Not yet. The forum has account privacy protections, but the language in all 3 posts uses a very specific medical administrative vocabulary. It reads more like an internal communication lightly adapted for a public forum than something a physician would write casually. She tapped the page. I'm working on it. I looked out the back window. The oak tree at the far end of the yard stood bare against the pale afternoon sky. I had planted that tree decades ago when Thomas was just a boy, long before he traded his roots for a clean laboratory coat and an office with a view. My phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number 937 area code. I picked it up. Is this Arthur Pendleton? The voice was a woman's older with the warmth of long habit. The man who carried that little girl out of the snow. That's me, I said. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I live in Kettering on Maple Ridge Drive. My daughter-in-law showed me the clip this morning. A pause. I wanted to call because I think when a person does something decent on a night like that, they ought to hear about it from somebody who isn't a television camera. Something in my chest shifted very slightly towards something that was not pain. Mrs. Brooks, I said, it's good to meet you. Likewise. You sounded like a sensible man in that interview. Not a hero, just a sensible man who did the right thing and then told the truth about why he was there. A short pause. That's rarer than it should be. Thank you, I said. And I meant it in the simple way you mean something when the simplicity itself is what you needed most. I won't keep you, Eleanor said. But some of us understand that particular feeling of finding somewhere useful to be when there isn't room for you where you expected. A brief pause. Get yourself a decent meal tonight, Arthur. Incidentally, I make excellent pot roast incidentally. I'll be in touch. The call ended. I held the phone for a moment, then set it down. Rachel was watching me. Not intrusively, just the way a person watches when they've seen something quiet and real and don't want to interrupt it. Someone you know, she asked. Someone I just met, I said. She nodded and didn't press it. We worked for another half hour, questions, answers, careful words on both sides. At one point, I asked what would happen to Lucas if she ran the full story. She closed her laptop, folded her hands on top of it, and looked at me directly. I think about that too, she said. But a child who grows up inside a comfortable lie carries that weight. The truth protects him more than the silence does. She gathered her papers. I held her coat at the door. She walked down the porch steps, then stopped and came back. She sat down in the same chair and put her bag on the floor. One more thing, she said. I have a source inside the hospital. They reached out this morning. She paused. There's documentation, financial records, and digital access logs for those posts that Thomas apparently doesn't know are still on the hospital's server. Activity logs. Retained for 90 days automatically as standard policy. And the posts, I said, were made during business hours, she said. From inside the building. I exhaled slowly. I meet the source tomorrow at 8, Rachel said. She pulled on her gloves, opened the door, and looked back once. Get some sleep, Mr. Pendleton. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. The door closed. I turned the legal pad face down, picked up my phone, and called Margaret at the warming center. I told her I'd be in early. She should leave me a list of whatever they needed most. There was a long day coming. I might as well be useful before it arrives. I arrived at the warming center at 6:30 before the sun had committed to anything. Margaret was already at the supply table near the back wall, sorting through a late delivery of canned goods, pinto beans, chicken broth, and a bag of brown rice that had split along one seam and left a thin trail across the floor. I'll sweep that, I said. Good morning to you, too, she said without looking up. I found the broom and cleared the rice, then helped stack the cans in their proper order along the back shelves. We worked without much conversation. Margaret understood that some people came here to give their hands something purposeful when their minds needed settling. She had the rare gift of leaving that space open without comment. By 8 o'clock, the first guests had arrived. Walter Gaines came through the door at 8:12, stamping snow from his boots, with the precision of a man who had once kept a schedule that mattered. He nodded at me. I nodded back. He took his usual chair near the window and accepted coffee from Margaret without being asked. I watched him wrap both hands around the cup. I thought $25,000. I thought of it this way: you press a bruise not to test it again, but because the tenderness has become its own information. My phone rang at 9:15. I was carrying an empty box to the recycling bin near the side door when it vibrated in my jacket pocket. Rachel Bennett. Arthur, she said. No preamble, no greeting. Just my name spoken by someone moving economically through the morning. I need to come to you. Is that all right? I'm at the warming center. I can be home by 10:30. That works exactly. A brief pause, not hesitation, but the pause of someone measuring what to say over an open line. I found more than I expected. I'll bring everything. She ended the call. I stood beside the recycling bin and listened to the sounds behind me. Murmured conversation. A chair scraping the floor, the coffee urn working through its second batch. Walter was telling someone an old story worn smooth by many retellings. I heard the other person laugh softly. I went back inside and worked out the remaining hour. Rachel arrived at my house at 10:35. She went straight to the kitchen table without being directed the way people go directly to the place where serious things get discussed. She set a large manila envelope down and looked at it for a moment. Before she opened it, the particular pause of someone who understands that opening something changes what it is. She removed a sheaf of papers, perhaps 15 pages, some printed landscape style, with columns of data, some portrait style with header information and timestamps. She laid 3 pages side by side across the table. Access logs, she said. Generated automatically by the hospital's internal IT system. Every time a user logs in every external platform they visit, it's all recorded. The logs are kept 90 days before they purge. I leaned forward and studied the columns. Times, account identifiers, internal IP addresses, URLs. The source printed these before they could be altered, Rachel continued. Her finger moved to the leftmost column. This is the account, t.pendleton@daytonregional.org. She moved right. This is the workstation's internal IP address, and this, she tapped the URL column, is where that session went. I read the domain name clearly, ohiomedconnect.org. 9:47, I said. 3 minutes before the first post appeared, Rachel said. The forum timestamps are public. I confirmed them last night. She moved to the second page. December 26th, 11:15. Same account, same workstation. 4 minutes before the second post. Third page. December 27th, 8:02 in the morning. Third post went live at 8:06. I straightened up. I looked at the 3 pages arranged across my kitchen table in the thin winter light coming through the window. Outside, snow from 2 days earlier had packed against the sidewalk into a gray-white crust. The temperature hadn't bothered to melt. Thomas had been at his desk, in his office at Dayton Regional Medical Center, in the building where his title sat on a door and his department reported to him. He had opened a browser window, navigated to a credentialed medical professionals forum, and typed 3 posts calling his father unstable, erratic, and financially irresponsible. During a gap between consultations, most likely. I said nothing for a long moment. Rachel sat quietly. She poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher on the counter and waited in the way that experienced people wait, without pressure, without filling the silence unnecessarily. He knew about the 90-day window, I said. Probably, she said. Whether he knew the exact retention period is less certain, but the posts went up on the 26th and 27th. He may have assumed they'd be safely purged before anyone thought to look. He didn't account for a source, I said. He didn't account for a source, she agreed. I picked up the first page and held it carefully. T. Pendleton at DaytonRegional.org. A string of characters assigned by a hospital IT department the week he started his position. He had used it to document patient care and schedule procedures and build year by year a professional reputation that he believed was worth protecting. And on the morning after Christmas, he had used it to try to make sure that anyone searching my name would find reason to doubt me. I set the page down. What does this mean legally? I asked. Rachel reached into her canvas bag and produced a business card, which she placed on the table between us. Denise Porter, attorney at law. Civil litigation, employment defamation, whistleblower cases. South Main Street, Dayton. Margaret knew her, Rachel said. She's done pro bono work for the warming center over the years. I called her at 7 this morning. She cleared the time at 3 o'clock. A pause. She said to bring anything you're willing to leave with her. How is the source protected? I asked. Rachel nodded slowly. Ohio's whistleblower statute covers nonprofit and healthcare employees who report financial irregularities through internal channels first, which this person did. When nothing happened, they came to me. She folded her hands on the table. I won't publish anything that identifies them. That line doesn't move. Good, I said. I picked up the business card and placed it in my shirt pocket, the same pocket where Claire's folded note had been the day before. I thought about Walter Gaines with his hands around a paper cup. I thought about Margaret holding that hospital letter on Christmas night saying we're running on fumes. I thought about 15 blankets driven to Riverside in a snowstorm because there was no one else to take them. $25,000 redirected to a conference Thomas co-chaired with a $600 registration fee per attendee. A signature I had watched develop from block letters on a 3rd-grade worksheet. I'll be at Denise Porter's office at 3, I said. Rachel nodded, finished her coffee, and stood. She pulled on her coat and looked back once from the kitchen doorway. One more thing, she said. Denise will ask if you're prepared for this to get louder before it gets quieter. I want you to hear the question before she asks it. I looked at the 3 pages still spread across my table, at the pale winter light on the window, at the stack of blankets I was planning to take to the warming center tomorrow morning. I've been quiet for a long time, I said. I think I can manage loud. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and left. The door closed. I had a 3 o'clock appointment. I had a warming center to return to in the morning. And somewhere across the city, in a building on South Main Street, a woman named Denise Porter had cleared her afternoon calendar and was already reading what Rachel had sent her. Things were going to move. I was ready. The message from Denise Porter was waiting on my phone when I woke at 5:30. She had sent it at 11:47 the previous night, late enough that I recognized her as someone who kept the same hours that serious problems keep. It said letter delivered via email at 11:32 p.m. Certified mail in transit. Expect movement today. 9 words after the first sentence. Exactly enough. I set the phone on the kitchen table, filled the kettle, and stood at the window while the burner heated. Outside, overnight temperatures had pressed the thin new snow into a hard, pale crust along the back steps. The street beyond was dark and still. The city was sleeping the deep, unhurried sleep it reserves for the week between Christmas and New Year's, when the year has mostly passed itself, and the calendar is simply waiting out the final days. I poured the coffee and thought about Thomas reading that email. Whether he'd been at his desk on Elmwood Drive at 11:30, or whether he'd found it this morning on his phone in the first minutes of waking, I didn't know. But I knew his face. I had known it for 35 years, the way you know a landscape you grew up alongside. I knew what it did when something had gone wrong in ways he hadn't accounted for. I wasn't happy about any of it. I want to be clear about that. There was no satisfaction in what was happening, not the clean kind that stories sometimes promise. Not because he'd won anything, because there was nothing left to hold. Denise called at 8:45. The hospital's legal office contacted me at 8 this morning, she said. She had the same precise, unhurried quality I'd heard in her office the afternoon before, the voice of someone who organizes her thoughts before picking up the phone. Not to contest the letter. They asked for clarification on the scope of the preservation request, specifically whether we were asking them to hold records from Thomas's department only or from the broader administrative structure. What did you tell them? I asked. To preserve everything related to the community benefit reallocation and the forum access logs, and that the scope of any future requests would depend on what their own review turns up. A pause. They're investigating internally. That was clear from the questions they asked. Questions of an institution trying to understand what one of its employees has done, not of an institution preparing to defend him. I understood her meaning immediately. Their lawyers aren't his lawyers, I said. Exactly right, she said. When an employee's behavior creates legal exposure for the institution's first obligation is to protect itself. That's not disloyalty. That's simply how it works. A brief pause. Expect contact from his personal attorney before the end of the week, assuming he retains one. All right, I said. Don't contact Thomas or anyone in his immediate household. If Claire reaches out again, that's her choice to make, but don't initiate. Let this develop. Understood, I said. She hung up. I sat at the kitchen table with the phone in my hand and the newspaper I hadn't yet opened, and the pale winter light coming through the window over the sink. Then I set the phone down and looked at my hands resting flat on the table. I gave the morning over to small, useful things. I called Margaret and told her I'd be in tomorrow. I drove to the pharmacy on Wayne Avenue to fill a prescription I'd been putting off. I stopped at the hardware store on Wilmington Pike and bought weather stripping for the back door, which had been letting cold air in for 2 winters. I came home and fixed the door, 40 minutes longer than it should have taken, because my left hand was still stiff from the cut. But I got it done. I pressed the strip along the base of the frame and tested it twice and felt the quiet satisfaction of a seal that finally held. Small things, useful things, the kind that don't ask anything of you except attention. I was heating soup at 5:15 when the phone rang. Claire. I turned the burner on low and answered. Arthur? Her voice carried a different quality than the sidewalk conversation 3 mornings ago. The careful, measured quality was still there, but underneath it was something steadier, the sound of a person who has made a decision and is now carrying it rather than deliberating over it. I'm calling because I thought some things should come from me directly. I'm glad you called, I said. My father withdrew from the joint venture this morning, she said. He called Thomas this afternoon to make it formal. A brief pause. And I've made an appointment with an attorney. My own. Someone with no connection to Thomas or my family's firm. I stood at the stove and let that settle. I wanted you to hear it from me, she said. Thank you, I said. Then, Claire, I need to ask you something. All right, Lucas, I said. In all of this, wherever it goes, that's the only thing I'm asking about. Not the lawsuit, not Thomas's career. just Lucas. She was quiet for a moment that had weight to it. "I know that," she said. And her voice when she said it had the quality of something she had already understood and was simply confirming. "I know that, Arthur." I didn't push further. There was nothing to push toward. She had already said the thing that mattered. "Are you and Lucas safe?" I asked. "Yes," she said. The steadiness in it was real. "Thomas is not well right now, but we're safe." "Good," I said. "Then are you all right?" A small sound, not quite a laugh, but in the neighborhood of one. That's probably the most honest question either of us has been asked all week. A pause. "I'm managing." "That's enough for now," I said. "Yes," she said. "It is." Another pause. "Get some rest, Arthur. Things are going to keep moving." She hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a while after that, the phone in one hand and the soup spoon in the other. The pot sat quiet on the cooling burner. Outside the newly sealed door, the cold was doing what December cold does in Ohio, settling in patiently and thoroughly in no hurry at all. I thought about Lucas in his room on Elmwood Drive, about Claire making an appointment with her own lawyer. I reheated the soup. I ate it slowly with bread, and the newspaper I still hadn't managed to read. The radiator knocked twice against the baseboard, the way it always did when the temperature dropped below 15. I had lived in this house for 19 years, and I knew every sound it made the same way you know the sounds of anything that has sheltered you long enough. Somewhere across the city, Thomas was in his office with the door closed. Somewhere on Elmwood Drive, a 5-year-old boy was asleep with a mobile of wooden planets turning slowly in the ceiling draft. And a grandfather who was turned out not too busy after all. I cleared the table, washed the bowl and spoon, turned out the kitchen light. Tomorrow things would keep moving. I intended to be ready. Rachel's text arrived at 6:22. "It's up. Take your time reading it." I made coffee first. My father's rule, 10 minutes of quiet before you go chasing the day. I gave myself exactly that standing at the kitchen window, watching a sparrow work the frozen bird feeder, before I sat down and opened the laptop. The headline read, "Dayton Surgeon Linked to Defamatory Posts Community Fund Diversion Records Show." Rachel had published at 6 o'clock that morning, with a companion broadcast scheduled for noon. The piece was methodical, every claim sourced, every number documented. The Form 990 reallocation. The conference co-chair listed Thomas's name beside it. The forum timestamps matched against the access logs. She had written a private individual throughout the defamation section, which I understood and appreciated. The facts needed no personal color from me to carry their own weight. I read the warming center section twice. $25,000. 6 consecutive years of funding, 1 signature. I drank my coffee, which had gone cold, and sat looking at the bare oak in the backyard. I had planted that tree the year Thomas started first grade. He had helped me press the soil down with both hands, patting it the way children do when they want something to take hold. Margaret called at 8 o'clock. "We've received $18,400 in donations since the article went live," she said. Her voice had the quality of someone trying very hard not to be overwhelmed. "In 2 hours. One woman called from Cincinnati, Arthur." "That's good, Margaret," I said. "I know it's good. I just need a bigger spreadsheet." A breath. "Come in tomorrow. We're going to need hands." "I'll be there," I said. Denise called at 10:30. Thomas had retained personal counsel, a man named Gregory Holt, from a Columbus litigation firm. His first proposal was mutual confidentiality in exchange for withdrawal of the cease and desist. Denise had declined without consulting me, which was exactly what I had hired her to do. Then she read me the hospital's formal statement. Dayton Regional had placed the staff member in question on paid administrative leave pending the conclusion of an internal review. Bloodless language, precise and inevitable, the way institutions protect themselves when an employee has made protection impossible. "It means his behavior is now part of an official record," Denise said, "independent of anything we do, subpoenable in a civil action. Understood, I said. Are you all right, Arthur? I thought about it honestly. I'm fine, I said. Keep going. The blue envelope was in the mailbox that afternoon. Navy stock city seal embossed at the top, return address from the office of the mayor. I stood on the porch, holding it for a moment, before going inside. The letter nominated me for the Dayton Community Heroes Recognition Ceremony on January 15th at the Convention Center, citing my actions on the night of December 25th on Route 35 East during severe weather conditions. I read it twice. Then I folded it and set it on the table. I sat there a while, not because it meant nothing. It did, but because I wasn't yet sure what shape the meaning would take. What I knew was simpler than the language on the cream stock paper. I had driven to Riverside because Margaret had made a promise. I had pulled over on Route 35 because a car was wrong-shaped in the dark. I had gone down the embankment because a child was crying, and there was nobody else on that road. None of those decisions had felt like the actions of someone who deserved official recognition. They had felt like the only available options. I put the letter in the drawer beside Claire's 5-word note. Then I drove to the hardware store for caulk and spent the rest of the afternoon sealing the bathroom window that had been leaking cold air since November. Small things, useful things, the kind that asks nothing of you except to show up and finish. On the 2nd of January, I opened my eyes at 7:15 without an alarm. No sound had woken me. No anxiety had pulled me up before I was ready. The bedroom was pale and still, and the neighborhood outside was doing what neighborhoods do on winter mornings, a car starting somewhere, a distant snowplow working a cross street, ordinary sounds that asked nothing of me. I lay there and listened for a few minutes. Then I got up and made coffee. Eleanor called at exactly 9 o'clock. Saturday at 2, she said. 1847 Maple Ridge Drive. Don't bring anything. All right, I said. A pause. That means flowers, wine, or anything with a bow. A jar or a bag is acceptable if a person insists, but nothing wrapped. I looked at the kitchen table where I'd already been thinking about what to bring. Understood, I said. 2 o'clock, she said, and hung up. I noticed I was smiling. Not at anything complicated, just at something small and good that didn't require examination. Saturday came in gray, and still the patient cold of early January that knows it has months ahead and isn't hurrying. I drove west on Route 35 into Kettering, just after 1:45. The streets there were narrower than Dayton's, lined with post-war brick colonials and maples that had grown into the power lines over 60 years. The kind of neighborhood that announced without saying anything directly that most of the people inside had been there a long time. 1847, Maple Ridge Drive was a white brick colonial with dark blue shutters and 2 junipers on either side of the front walk, both bowed under accumulated snow. The walk had been cleared in a single narrow path, exactly as advertised. I had a jar of strawberry preserves in my coat pocket. Eleanor Brooks was smaller than her voice. Perhaps 5'2", white hair cut close and deliberate gold-rimmed glasses, a canvas apron over a blue wool sweater. She looked at the jar in my hand without expression. Strawberry, she said. Yes, I said. Donald always brought blueberries. She took it without ceremony. He claimed he preferred it. I always suspected he thought blueberry seemed less assuming. Strawberry takes a position. She stepped back. Come in before the cold does. The house was warm and full of books. On the kitchen stove, a Dutch oven sat with its lid slightly open, and the smell from it, beef root vegetables, something herbal, rearranged my sense of what I needed. I realized I was genuinely hungry in a way I hadn't been in 2 weeks. Eleanor put coffee in front of me without asking how I took it. Set the strawberry preserves beside the bread already on the table, and sat across from me with her hands around her own mug. We talked while the pot finished. She told me about Donald, who had died 8 years ago of a heart condition that arrived without warning one morning. They had been married 41 years. She said 41 years was long enough to have been furious at a person for months and to have said things that couldn't be taken back, and to have had stretches where they were simply two people sharing a house rather than a life. I asked if she would do it again, knowing everything. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses. "Every difficult day," she said, "and some of them were very difficult." We ate at the maple table. The pot roast was exactly what she had promised. Not the kind of food that announces itself, but the kind made by someone who has cooked the same dish so many times that it no longer requires thought, only attention. I ate more than I had at a single sitting in weeks. Eleanor noticed and said nothing, only refilled my coffee and moved the bread closer to my side of the table. Afterward, she brought apple cake. We sat with the second cup, and the conversation slowed into the unhurried territory that opens up when two people have decided, without saying so, that they are not going anywhere for a while. She asked about the mail, not about Thomas or the lawsuit or the warming center, about what 32 years of walking the same streets had taught me. What stayed with you? I told her about a basset hound named Ferdinand on Maple Avenue, who had known my footsteps before I turned the corner, and had gone one morning with no explanation, gate latched, and how I'd carried that small absence for the rest of the route. She laughed the same full, unguarded laugh I'd heard on the phone, and I laughed too, the involuntary kind, the kind that catches you before you can decide whether the moment warrants it. At 4:15, I put on my coat. Eleanor took my scarf from the rack, straightened it, where I'd hung it crookedly, and handed it back without comment. "I'll have that chair leg fixed before you come again," she said. "I'd appreciate that," I said. I was at the end of the front walk when she spoke from the doorway. "I'll see you on the 15th then." I turned around. "David Miller invited me to the hero ceremony," she said, adjusting her glasses. "We've served on the hospital's community foundation board together for 6 years. He mentioned your name in connection with his daughter. I didn't feel it was appropriate to tell him we'd already spoken." I stood in the cold and understood what she was telling me. Dr. David Miller, Dean of Dayton Regional Lily's father, the man whose institution had placed Thomas on administrative leave, would be at the Dayton Convention Center on January 15th, and Eleanor Brooks would be sitting beside him. "Small city Arthur," she said. "Everything connects eventually. Drive carefully. The roads ice over after dark." She went inside and closed the door. I stood a moment in the fading January light, the juniper shadows long across the snow. Then I walked to my car, got in, and sat with both hands on the wheel. 10 days. This is the afternoon I finally understood the difference between being seen and being used. The 15th of January came in gray and still. I stood at the bathroom mirror at 8:30 in the navy suit I had bought for Thomas and Claire's wedding. White shirt, no tie. I had started to put one on and then set it on the dresser without ceremony. The collar was fine without it. I looked at myself for a moment. 62 years old. A retired mail carrier from East Dayton. A man who had pulled a child from a wrecked car in a snowstorm because there had been nobody else on that road. I did not feel like a hero. I felt like a man who had done a few things right and been seen doing them, which is a different thing entirely. I drove downtown. The convention center on 5th Street was already moving. When I arrived, volunteers directing people a registration table staffed by someone checking names with practiced calm. I gave mine. I received a badge and a program and found the reception outside Ballroom B. Eleanor was already there. Deep green jacket, ivory brooch, a glass of water, and her full attention aimed at whoever was speaking to her. She saw me cross the room and excused herself without hurry. "You look respectable," she said. "High praise," I said. "It is from me." She turned. "Come. David wants to meet you properly." Dr. David Miller was lean and silver-haired, with the posture of someone who had spent decades being the steadiest person in difficult rooms. His handshake became two-handed when he reached me, and I understood from that alone that this was not formality. "My daughter calls you the snowman," he said quietly, glancing at the young mother beside him. "Not because you're made of it, because you came out of it." He steadied his voice. I owe you something I cannot repay. I want you to know I understand that completely. His daughter, Sarah Miller, was beside him. She held my hand and trembled slightly, and said thank you twice, stopping both times before she finished, which told me everything she meant to say. Lily stood behind her mother in a red dress with a lopsided bow in her hair, watching me with the thorough, systematic attention of a 4-year-old evaluating something unfamiliar. I bent down to her level. Mommy says you carried me, she said. I did, I said. She considered this seriously. Were you scared? A little, I said. Were you? She thought about it honestly. I don't remember. Then without transition. Can I have a cookie now? Sarah laughed. The involuntary kind, wet-eyed and sudden. I was already smiling. The ceremony was warm and unhurried. 7 people were recognized. Good work, named properly, which cities do not do often enough. When my name was called, I walked to the podium and stood there without notes. I was somewhere I didn't expect to be that night, I said. But it turned out to be exactly where I needed to be. I think that happens more often than we plan for. I think we find out who we are in the places we didn't plan to go. The applause came sincere and unrushed. During the reception, I was standing at the window watching 5th Street when a hand came down on my shoulder. Practiced. Intentional. Thomas, charcoal suit, silk tie. The composed smile I had known since he was 16, the one built for rooms for outcomes. And 2 steps behind him, slightly to his left, a man with a camera. A smaller unit, social media grade, already recording. He had arranged this. The calculation was clear and immediate, a reconciliation scene at a civic ceremony attended by local press and city officials. A clip that corrected the narrative. Son supports father. Camera rolling. Dad, he said, warm enough, loud enough. I'm proud of you. I looked at the camera. I looked at Thomas. I looked at the smile. I set my glass down on the table beside me. Quietly below the range of the camera, 2 steps behind him, I said, not here. Not like this. Something moved beneath his surface. A flicker of something unscripted. Then the surface closed again. He gave one small, controlled nod. Give me 5 minutes, I said. I walked away unhurried. Found Eleanor at the edge of the room. She had seen everything. I met her eyes and gave her a small, deliberate nod. She returned it steady, confirming. I found Rachel near the side aisle. Stay close, I said. She didn't ask why. Her hand moved to her notepad. I turned and walked back to Thomas. Together we moved toward the hallway. At the conference room door, I held it open for Thomas, then for the camera operator as well, which briefly unsettled him. Inside, when the camera operator started to follow, I looked at him. Just us, I said. He looked at Thomas. Thomas gave a small nod that cost him something visible. The door closed. The room was quiet. The table was clean and empty between us. The room was very quiet. Through the wall came the distant sound of the reception, muffled music, conversation, the ordinary noise of people gathered for something decent. In here, there was just the fluorescent light and the oval table, and 2 men who had known each other for 35 years, standing on opposite sides of both. Thomas spoke first. You didn't have to make a scene. I didn't make a scene, I said. Refusing me in front of a room full of people. I said not here. That's not a scene. That's a preference. I looked at him. You brought a camera, Thomas. His jaw tightened. I thought it might help. Show people that we're what? He stopped. I waited. That we're fine, he said finally. That this whole thing has been blown out of proportion. I looked at my son, really looked at him the way you look at something you've been too close to for too long, and are finally seeing clearly. The pressed suit. The composed face. The word fine used to describe a situation in which he had signed a letter cutting funding from a shelter for people with nowhere to go, had typed false things about me from his office. Computer had handed me an envelope of money and asked me to disappear. Do you actually believe that? I asked. Or is that what you need me to say? Something shifted in his expression. Just slightly. Just enough. Dad. His voice changed register softer now, a key lower. The voice I remembered from when he was young and wanted something he wasn't sure he could have. I know I handled things badly. I know I did. But if you'll just let me explain. You don't need to explain, I said. I understand everything that happened. Then you know I was under pressure. The hospital, Claire's family, the publicity, I panicked. People do things when they panic that they wouldn't otherwise. Thomas. I said his name quietly. Not harshly. Just clearly. I'm not here to argue about what you did. I've already given that to people who know what to do with it. He stared at me. I'm here, I said, because you're the one who wanted this room. So say what you actually came to say. The softness left his face. You want to destroy me, he said. That's what this is. The lawsuit, the reporter, all of it, you're enjoying this. I'm not, I said, and I meant it completely. Then drop it. All of it. Tell Bennett you won't cooperate. Tell your lawyer to stand down. And I'll make sure you can see Lucas whenever. Stop. My voice was still quiet. Don't use that boy as a bargaining chip again. Not in this room. Not ever again. Silence. I've thought about this for a long time, I said. About what I wanted. About whether I wanted you back if things were different. And I've arrived somewhere I didn't entirely expect. Thomas watched me. Something in him had gone very still. I love you, I said. I will probably always love you in the way that doesn't ask permission and doesn't go away. That's not something I get to choose. I paused. But I don't have a son, not anymore. What I have is a man I used to raise, and what he became is not something I'm willing to carry. Thomas's face did something then. Something I hadn't seen on it in a very long time. Something that might have been real, or might have been the last performance. I genuinely couldn't tell, and I understood standing there that not being able to tell is itself the answer. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the table. He looked at me once more. Then he walked to the door, opened it, and left. I stood in the empty room for a long moment. The fluorescent light hummed above me. Through the wall, someone laughed bright and unguarded, the laugh of a person who had nothing to manage. I put both hands flat on the oval table. 62 years old. A retired mail carrier from East Dayton, still standing. I picked up my coat from the chair where I'd set it, and I walked back out into the light. They came the way most important things come quietly, one ordinary day at a time, each arriving slightly different from the one before in ways that only became visible when you looked back from a distance. In February, Dayton Regional Medical Center concluded its internal review and terminated Thomas's employment, effective immediately. Denise read the formal statement to me over the phone in her usual measured way, no commentary, no editorializing, just the words as they were written. I said thank you and didn't add much else. There wasn't much else to add. The civil settlement arrived 3 weeks later. I signed the payment directly over to the Dayton Community Warming Center. Margaret received the check without ceremony and put it to use before the week was out, heating oil blankets and 2 months of operating costs covered in a single transaction. That felt correct. That felt like the right shape for the money to take. Also, in February, I filed a petition for grandparent visitation under Ohio Revised Code, Section 3109.051. Claire did not contest it. The hearing was brief. I want to say that plainly because it matters more than almost anything else in this account. The first time I saw Lucas under that arrangement was a Saturday morning at Eastwood Metro Park, the second week of March. He came running across the parking lot, not precisely toward me, but toward something he had already decided he wanted, and grabbed my hand without preamble or explanation, the way children claim things they consider theirs. We walked the river path for 2 hours. He told me about a library book on volcanoes, About a friend at school who could burp the alphabet up to the letter G, which Lucas considered a significant achievement. He stopped at every interesting rock along the path, and several that were not particularly interesting by any measurable standard. At some point, without looking up from the ground, he asked if I was coming back next week. I told him yes. He accepted this and moved on to the next rock. The warming center on weekday mornings, Lucas on alternating Saturdays, Eleanor on Thursdays. Thomas, I heard, had relocated to Columbus. That was all I knew and all I needed to know. I was 62 years old. I had a grandson who collected rocks from river paths and asked straightforward questions and expected honest answers. I was on balance all right. Looking back at the entire journey, I realized the silence after that cold Christmas door closed was not just a temporary wound. It was a profound awakening. I used to believe that being a devoted father meant absorbing all pain silently, sacrificing my happiness, and hiding bone-deep truths away to protect my beloved child. But I was completely wrong. God is my witness that I dedicated 32 long years of life to a son who ultimately judged his father by a frayed old coat. If you are currently walking the path of parenthood, please do not be like me. Do not endure unconditional disrespect. Do not confuse sacrifice with tolerating pure selfishness. Love needs firm boundaries, not endless tolerance. Now my life passes in total peace. I tell meaningful grandpa stories to Lucas by the river, watching him pick pebbles. These grandpa stories are built on truth, not sweet lies. Every family has deep scars, but you choose what to carry. This family story taught me it is never too late to stand tall, leave toxicity, and walk into light. Those are the grandpa stories that have real value. My family story ends opening a lesson for anyone losing themselves for children. Hopefully, this final family story helps you find your path. The upcoming stories have a few fictional details built for educational purposes. If you feel these real-life corners do not suit your personal view, please exit and choose other content that is far more appropriate for your own path.